Mr. Hirsch is author of Hurricane, The Miraculous Journey of Reuben Carter, and Riot and Remembrance, The Tulsa Race War and Its Legacy. He is a former reporter for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. And please help me in welcoming Mr. Hirsch this evening.
Well, thank you all for coming out tonight, and my thanks to the Lowell Institute and the Ford Hall Forum for making this debate possible. Before I introduce our speakers, I just want to say a few words about reparations to place it in context. Reparations for slavery would compensate African Americans for an injustice that occurred more than a century ago. But is retroactive justice possible? Is it wise? Or is it even just? These questions are not new. After the Civil War, freed slaves were granted 40 acres and a mule, but that offer of reparation was later rescinded. Indeed, the prospect of reparation, of compensating Southern blacks for their labor, was soon crushed by a wave of betrayal, segregation, disenfranchisement, riots, lynching, exclusion, and intimidation. For most of the 20th century, advocates of reparations were considered radicals, or radical scholars, and the issue received little attention. Rather, the modern civil rights movement focused on removing the legal barriers that would allow African Americans full participation in American life. By the end of the 20th century, these legal efforts had largely succeeded, though discrimination had certainly not been eliminated, and debate still raged on how blacks could close the economic and educational gaps. Only in the last couple of years did reparations enter the mainstream of public discourse. The most important catalyst was a book written by Randall Robinson, which argued that the economic gap between white and black America reflected the legacy of slavery as well as years of subsequent discrimination. Robinson's proposed reparation was far less extreme than often depicted in the press. He did not advocate that the federal government write checks to descendants of slaves. Rather, he argued that it should create a large trust fund to fuel economic and educational opportunities for African Americans. He recast the traditional argument for government intervention by focusing on the most appalling, the most deplorable, the most shocking violation blacks have ever faced: slavery. This argument struck a chord. At a time when affirmative action programs were in retreat in corporate America and under assault in the courts, reparations became the new battle cry, and some of the country's most prominent black lawyers and activists pressed the case. Legal scholars, some of whom have been researching the matter for years, filed lawsuits against blue-chip banks, insurers, and railway, tobacco, media, and textile companies, all of which profited from the slave trade. Also coming under fire were universities and state and federal governments, which as well benefited from America's peculiar institution. Now city councils across America have passed resolutions to study reparations. Universities in New York and California have launched large research projects on the feasibility of compensation. California has passed a law requiring insurance companies to disclose whether they ever wrote policies on slaves. And just this month, Chicago became the first city in the United States to require all businesses to research and report on any ties they had to the slave trade. The issue will undoubtedly be debated in the next presidential contest. While advocates of reparations believe that there is no statute of limitations on a moral obligation, opponents believe their position against reparations is more firmly grounded in American tradition and values. They say that Americans are not responsible for the sins of their fathers, that taxpayers should not pay debts incurred more than 100 years ago, that corporate shareholders are not responsible for the misdeeds of previous management, and that reparations reinforce an ideology of victimhood that consigns African Americans to second-class status. There are also logistical issues. Who should get the money and how should it be paid, as well as what might be called the open spigot problem. If blacks receive money, will that not open the spigot to American Indians, Catholics, Jews, Hispanics, Mennonites, and many other aggrieved parties? Well, the one thing we do know about reparations is that it opens deep wounds as it combines white guilt, black anger, and money. I think the other thing that we know about reparations is that it's something that this country will be wrestling with for years to come. So in that spirit, I think we're very fortunate tonight to have two very insightful and distinguished speakers to share their opposing views. I will introduce them now, and each will present his and her position at the lectern. Depending on the time, I may follow up and answer and ask a few questions of my own, but even if I do, I will leave plenty of time for you to ask questions. Melissa Nobles will argue in favor of reparations. She is an associate professor of political science at MIT, where she teaches comparative politics. She's the author of Shades of Citizenship, Race and the Census in Modern Politics. Currently, she's writing a book that examines the political issues of official apologies in the United States and other countries. Professor Nobles holds a BA in history from Brown University and a PhD in political science from Yale University. Glenn Loury will argue against reparations. He's a professor of economics and director of the Institute on Race and Social Division at Boston University and has taught economics at Harvard, Northwestern, and the University of Michigan. He has published essays on racial inequality and social policy in dozens of publications at home and abroad. He's a contributing editor at the New Republic, and his most recent book is The Anatomy of Racial Inequality. Professor Loury holds a BA in mathematics at Northwestern University and has a PhD in economics from MIT. Professor Nobles.
Good evening. Talk of reparations for slavery and Jim Crow has indeed grown louder and more insistent in ways reminiscent of earlier times. Yet today, as in the past, the idea of reparations has been treated with a degree of dismissiveness, skepticism, and even distrust, as if this is the latest and greatest black hustle. But if we are going to think clearly and seriously about reparations, we have to reframe the debate. In my remarks this evening, I will offer another way of seeing reparations. I will place the U.S. reparations claims within a larger universe of claims so as to illustrate its validity as a political matter. I will argue that the U.S. reparation claims are in basic ways quite similar to those in other cases around the world. In these other countries, state authorities have responded to past injustices by using public funds. These societies have not been torn asunder in so doing, and the people who received the monies considered themselves to have been made better off by it. In these cases, the larger goal of societal reconciliation has been advanced, not thwarted. By the end of my talk, I hope that you'll have a greater appreciation of the basic political and ethical legitimacy of reparations. I also hope that you'll be more open to the possibilities and desirability of reparations as a viable policy option. Reparations are a global phenomenon. The Japanese-American World War II internment and Holocaust cases are well known. The German state has apologized and paid nearly $80 billion, not only to Holocaust survivors, but to the State of Israel. The U.S. government has issued an official apology and paid surviving Japanese-American claimants $20,000 each. But there are other cases. In the past 5 years, the Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand governments have all established reparations funds to pay for historic injustices against their Indigenous citizens. To provide $1 amount, the Canadian government has distributed $240 million to national Indigenous organizations. These funds are separate from ongoing land claims and other treaty violations claims being pursued in the court in the national legislature. In the 1960s, the Japanese government, in its efforts to normalize relations with South Korea, paid billions in reparations. You may have heard or even read about the recent agreement signed last month, signed actually September 18th, between North Korea and Japan, normalizing relations between the two countries. As it has in the past, the Japanese government expects to pay approximately $8 to $10 billion. In making the agreement of reparations, the Japanese government apologized for its history of colonial rule and, quote-unquote, the tremendous damage that colonial rule caused. As we see, these cases vary. They are different each from the other and from African-American reparations. Some of the reparations are settlements of war, and others are the results of domestic political organizing. Some reparations are for war crimes, and others for colonial rule and dispossession. Some reparations have been given to direct survivors, others to descendants of survivors. Some to whole groups, and some to individual claimants. Some reparations have been between governments, and others to governments, and others from governments to a segment of their domestic populations. Yet even with this variety, there are important commonalities that unite all of them, including the U.S., together. The first and most important commonality is that all are predicated on a fundamental recognition of historic injustices that governments must account for and must address materially. In my view, the injustices that were slavery and Jim Crow segregation should require no retelling as a justification for reparations, but I'll provide one. Slavery was the basis of the South's agricultural economy, and this economy, in turn, was crucially important to the nation's overall economic development. Southern cotton was the nation's leading export. It helped fuel textile manufacturing here in the North, and the money made from cotton exports paid for all manner of imports, including steel. Slavery was deeply implicated in the banking, insurance, and shipping industries. Politically, the federal government was firmly under control of what historians describe as the Southern slave powers. 5 of the first 7 presidents, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and Jackson, were slaveholders, and due to the 3/5 clause of the Constitution, the South was advantaged in congressional representation. Prior to the Civil War, the majority of cabinet members and the majority of Supreme Court justices were slaveholders. Slavery was the anchor of the economic, political, social, and cultural life of the South, and indeed of the nation. And yet, in spite of all of the wealth and power that their enslavement generated, with abolition, slaves were given not one thin dime. Instead, the vast majority were locked into debt peonage schemes, which amounted to, in effect, slavery without the chains, still picking cotton and now getting next to nothing. After Reconstruction, Jim Crow segregation became the law of the South and the practice in the North. The right to vote, the right to equal protection, and the right to vote, as guaranteed in the 14th and 15th Amendments of the Constitution, were largely dead letters in the South. The enduring legacies of slavery and Jim Crow are evident in spite of the impressive gains made by African Americans since the Civil Rights Movement. One dimension of this enduring legacy is the substandard housing, limited job opportunities, failing schools, and being subject to a carnivorous criminal justice system. Of course, one could certainly argue that many of these problems can be, and indeed should be, addressed by social welfare policies designed to assist poor and disadvantaged Americans. But there's another dimension of this legacy that is often ignored, and that dimension is this: the creation of a racial discourse that frames what it means to be black in America, such that whether you're from Jamaica, Chicago, or Ghana, whether your family goes back for generations, or whether you arrived here yesterday, whether your name is Nobles or Diallo, you bear the burden and brunt of this legacy. Slavery and Jim Crow are over and cannot be undone, but the situation that they've set in motion can be redressed, and that is the point of reparations. The second important commonality between American reparations and others is the expected source of the monies. In all of the cases, the monies came from public coffers. Clearly, in using public funds, there's a recognition in these other cases of the continuity of the state and of national identity. We as Americans have no problem claiming Washington and Jefferson as national heroes, and certainly the Constitution that they drafted is still binding. Claiming that national past also entails acknowledging its wrongs. So, here in the U.S., some portion of public dollars would be set aside for reparations. Charles Ogletree, the co-chairman of the Reparations Coordinating Committee, has written that some sort of community fund is most preferable rather than individual checks. Because reparations would be drawn from public funds, all citizens would be contributors to it, including African Americans. The money used to compensate Japanese Americans, for example, were public funds that included taxes that Japanese Americans paid. Whatever the amount of money agreed upon, it will be a political decision. By that, I mean it will not only be decided by Congress, but also that it would be an amount of money that would bear no direct or even clear resemblance to the amount of the injustice. For example, $20,000 could in no way fully compensate Japanese Americans for their loss of property and freedom. But the money and the apology did go in some meaningful, although not exhaustive way, towards righting a wrong. Finally, the last important commonality between the U.S. case and others is the shared perception that a larger goal of societal reconciliation has been advanced. This is not to suggest that in these other countries the debates about past injustices and reparations were not contentious. Obviously they were. But my point is that reparations in the end have been judged to be largely more beneficial than not. And there is no reason to expect, or at least very little reason to expect, that the same couldn't or wouldn't be true here in the United States. In a related way, the legitimacy of minority politics has not been appreciably diminished in the wake of reparations in these cases. Political life moves on, with groups pursuing their individual and collective interests. Indigenous Canadians, for example, have received state reparations, and they continue to press their claims in the courts and in other venues. The Canadian government has paid one debt to Indigenous Canadians, but their obligation to serve their citizens, including Indigenous people, does not vanish because they paid reparations. Excuse me. Not so graceful ending. Similarly, here in the U.S. government will make reparations, and it would also continue to protect and serve our interests as it is expected to do for all of its citizens. We will continue to pursue our individual and collective interests. In short, we as citizens, above all, and with reparations, we are only demanding that our government now behave justly. That is, that it behave in a way that it has so tragically and repeatedly failed to do in the past. Thank you.
Well, I have risen to speak against reparations. Now, I don't take any relish in this. This is not me having a good time here. I'm not full-throated, totally committed anti-reparations, worst thing in the world, let's stop it before America is run aground. That's not my position. I have a great deal of sympathy for what was just said, for the passion and the anger in Randall Robinson's book, for the sense of incompleteness here. We do have a problem with our history. It's a problem not yet fully reckoned with. It's one we haven't gotten past, and we have to deal with it. I simply don't agree with the political judgment that was just rendered at the end of Professor Noble's remarks that for African Americans here in the United States, the pursuit of this advocacy formulated in this way would not cost us anything in terms of our longer-term political objectives. I think it would cost us something. I'm worried about the day after reparations are paid, when poverty rates are still very high among African Americans, when 2/3 of our youngsters are born out of wedlock, when the jails are still overflowing with young black men, when the state is still ritualistically taking human life in public enactments of revenge. I'm talking about capital punishment. And the matter of fact is that more often or not, it's black life. I'm still worried about public schools that don't educate too many African American youngsters, and then when it comes time to reform those schools, we do it in effect by imposing apparatuses of testing and accountability that we know these black youngsters are going to come out on the short end of, and that implicitly we're saying, well, you just don't have what it takes to make it in the modern world. In other words, I'm worried about the historical reproduction of black subordination. That's the problem. I don't believe that reparations advocacy, if it were successful, would solve that problem. And what's worse, my fear is, were reparations advocacy successful, those who have the capacity to solve that problem, I'm talking about those who have power in the United States of America, I'm talking about corporate interests, I'm talking about vested political interests, I'm talking about the establishment, would be able to say, we paid. You Negroes have been paid. What? What's your complaint? You've been paid. Isn't it just like America to first rob a people, not only of their labor, but of their dignity, and then think that you can compensate in a materialistic way, in a commodified way, by giving them chits? The problem here is not the dispossession of wealth. The problem here is the denial of the humanity of a people based on their race. That's not going to be fixed by a quid pro quo transfer of funds. It's a relational, not a material problem that we talk about, the present-day manifestation of which is the deeply ingrained stigma that African Americans carry in American society. That's the thing that we have to grapple with. So I want to reformulate the reparations now demand. That's not going to be my rallying cry. I've got a different banner. Doesn't fit so easily on a bumper sticker. It's recognize black exceptionalism within a more expansive social democratic vision. That's what I'm for. That's the only way out, as I see it, out of the historical reproduction of black subordination. Recognize black exceptionalism within a more expansive social democratic vision. So there are two prongs to my alternative to reparations, my alternative advocacy that still takes the injury of the past seriously, but has a more open-ended and relational character in terms of how it thinks that we can deal with the past. More open-ended in that it's not a quid pro quo. You're not going to get paid off. This is not a bill. There's no cheap grace in my church. Okay? You don't just put a coin in the collection plate and then go on about your business. If those communities of despair and marginalization, I'm talking about the places that are some of the worst places to live in the industrial, wealthy West. Go to any country in Western Europe. Go to the impoverished. Go to the immigrant. Go to the dark-skinned communities. You don't see anything like what you see in east side of Detroit or North Philly or the west side of Chicago or South Central LA or a dozen other places that I could name. Right? The relational and open-ended view says that's unacceptable in America given our history. Whatever the causal consequence, whatever the causal process that produced that outcome is unacceptable. That outcome is reiterating in the 21st century a system of racial hierarchy that was born in the slavery of the 19th century. And sending checks won't cure that. It won't reverse that. Recognizing black exceptionalism within a more expansive social democracy. There are two prongs to that. Black exceptionalism, more expansive social democracy. I want to talk about both of them and then I'll sit down. Black exceptionalism simply means this. Check it out. 30 million new Americans since the liberalization of the immigration laws in the mid-1960s. Most of them didn't come from Europe. They came mostly from Latin America and Asia. They're not black people. It's no longer a black and white situation in America. Go to Miami, go to Houston, go to Los Angeles, God help us. Okay? Go to New York, go to Chicago. It's not a black and white situation in America anymore. Those new non-white Americans are Americans too. They've got a claim on the national narrative too. The way we're going to be talking about this issue 50 years from now, and I don't know how it's going to be, but I can assure you it's going to be very, very different than the way we're talking about it now. Check out the rate of intermarriage between Europeans and Asians. More than half of American-born women of Asian ancestry are marrying white men, according to analyses of the decennial census. Fine. Wonderful. More power to them. 2% of black women are marrying white men. Well, I guess there's something about black women and white men. I'm not going to claim to know what it is, not being either one of them. But what I do know is that intermarriage across racial lines is transforming the nature of race in our time. Okay? Where do we, African Americans, want to be in that larger picture? Okay? I think where we want to be is allies with people who are pushing a progressive political agenda that has broad and deep implications for how it is that we do business, how it is that we reform welfare, how it is that we educate our children, how it is that we incarcerate those who break our rules and our laws. Deep implications. Okay. We can't get there from here. That is, we African Americans who want to see a more progressive policy in this country can't get there from here without allies. And a lot of those allies are people who are not going to be able to buy into a reparations frame when it's formulated in terms of reparations for slavery. And yet there is something exceptional about the black experience. There is something particular about this history of slavery. There is something unique about the social and the cultural and the political manifestation of racial stigma as it bears on African Americans. I want that recognized, not grudgingly, fitfully, and momentarily as checks are passing hands or accounts are being jiggered, but deeply and in a sustained way and over time as relationships are redefined for the long term. Because the problem is a long-term problem. The problem of the African American family complex is a long-term problem. Lay the blame on slavery? Sure, have no problem with that. But laying the blame on slavery does not fix the problem. It's going to be with us for a while. Black exceptionalism within a more expansive social democracy means for me that there is no way to deal with the consequences of slavery as those consequences manifest themselves in the lives of African Americans. I'm talking about 1 million black men in jail, a war on drugs that treats a deep social problem. People with $100 bills want to get high. That's the deep social problem. By balancing our cultural budget on the back of the weakest and darkest of our citizens, namely those poor guys out there on the dangerous mean streets of urban America selling you those $50 bags that you want to buy with your $100 bills. Right? A deep social problem balanced on the back of those people. That's a problem. It's going to be with us for a while. I see no way to fix that problem for blacks alone. How can I fix war on drugs, wreaks havoc in the lives of poor, marginal men, and not fix that problem for Mexican, Chicano in Los Angeles? Not fix that problem for Puerto Ricans in New York City? How can I do anything about the fact that the public schools are the institutions of last resort and the entryway into the center of American society don't work for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of black children without fixing that problem for anybody who goes to schools that don't work in the cities and the towns of our country? There's no way to fix those problems for blacks alone, nor is there any justification for fixing those problems for blacks alone. Okay? So if we're serious about dealing with the problems of slavery, we have to understand that the remedies are broad, systemic. They are remedies that go right to the core of how we do business in the country. We won't get those remedies without a political coalition that extends beyond black people. So we ought to formulate our rhetoric of reform in such ways that other people can buy into it. The reparations advocacy, in my view, does not meet that test. Thank you.
Okay, I think I've got time to pose one or two questions to our panelists, and then I'll open it up for questions from you all. And maybe I'll start with Professor Nobles to respond to Professor Loury's comments that the downside of reparations is that there will be a white backlash, that whites will think that we've settled accounts, therefore we don't have to try to become more inclusive as a society. How would you respond to that?
Well, there's certainly that concern that whites will be against it and that they would think that somehow the debts were settled. But it seems to me that's where the role of advocacy and persuasion comes in. I mean, the notion that whites would be against it doesn't seem to me to be on its face something that shuts down the conversation. It just means that we would have to work harder at finding allies, and I think that's important. But I don't think that, I mean, our job would be upon getting reparations would be, as I said, to continue to press our claims in the public domain, as all citizens do, and to have them be taken into account in real time. I don't see these things as being mutually exclusive. I don't see dealing with the past and still dealing with the present as being things that can't be done together. So just as there's been whites were against the abolition of slavery, they were against the civil rights movement. Some came along, you work with those who come along, and those who don't eventually get there, one way or another. And in regards to Professor Loury's remarks that, well, we'd have immigrant groups, will they buy in or will they not? At least in Canada and Australia, both countries which are immigrant societies, not nearly to the extent as the U.S., but they've also opened up their borders. Australia had a whites-only policy until 1968, but now they have many people from particularly Asia in Australia, and they are buying into this notion. If they become Australian, they take on the nation's debts, its history and its debts, and they pay. Some are against it, but some are for it. So it seems to me that we would expect some contention, but that in and of itself doesn't veto the idea.
You want to respond?
Can I
Go
say
ahead.
something?
Absolutely.
I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not saying don't say this because white people will get mad. There will be a backlash. I mean, any movement for justice is going to meet with resistance. If you didn't argue for something you thought was right because you expected people to be against you or to be opposed to what you're going to argue, you would never get justice. So I'm not saying that. That would be a trivial mistake to make. It's more like this. What I'm saying is that we're dealing with a sacred civic matter here, and yet it's being talked about in a profane way. That's the thing that I'm trying to say. We're dealing with a relational problem here, and it's being talked about in a materialist way. We're dealing with the consequences of violating the person, with the consequences of recognizing the dignity of the person in the slave, that the injury of slavery is not dispossession of the return on labor, it's denigration of the dignity of the person. This is the thing that we're dealing with. That's why I talk about it as being sacred. The word should be in quotes, of course, but I'm talking about the making of America. I'm saying, how is it that we understand ourselves as a nation? This is a gaping and open wound for us, and it can't be sewn up with money. That's the thing that I'm saying. When you put it in those terms, you lose something. You lose something that you're not going to get back. That's the claim that I'm making. Not that whites will be angry, but that we ourselves, African Americans, ought not understand the injury in that way.
Let me follow up, Professor Loury, with this question. Some reparations advocates say that the purpose of the money is not to pay a debt or to make whole the losses that were incurred more than 100 years ago. The purpose of the money is symbolic. It's a recognition by America, by the federal government, to recognize what it did to an entire group of people. And while no amount of money can compensate the loss of dignity that you described, there is value in a symbolic gesture through money to acknowledge that wrong.
Okay, I think that's a mistake. That's the position that I'm trying to defend here, is that that view is a mistake, and let me say why. Of course, no amount of money can right certain kinds of wrongs, so that goes without saying. But look at symbolism, you can't eat it, and this can be very dangerous stuff. There are two cases. Either the scale of the money is large enough to really make a difference in the South Bronx, on the east side of Detroit, in South Central LA, in which case we ought not to do it because it would be unconscionable for us to undertake a huge, massive Marshall Plan-like social policy to revitalize cities and to formulate it in terms of compensation to black people. That's something that we ought to do, in my view, because they're people in those places, whatever their color. Or it's truly a symbolic gesture, and the scale of the intervention isn't enough to do anything about the problem, in which case all the arguments that I just got through making about how you bring false closure to a situation would apply. Either it's enough money to really make a difference, in which case it ought not to be formulated in racial terms, but it ought to be undertaken as a way of us Americans redefining our obligations to one another, or it's a symbolic gesture and not enough money to make a real difference, in which case we make the huge mistake of funneling down the weight of African American historical claims in this society onto a site of a relatively few hundreds of billions of dollars. I know that sounds like a lot of money, but play it out across 30 million people over a decade and you see that it's not.
Yes and no, Glenn. I mean, there are certainly cases when reparations have been given when they've struck a third middle ground, which is that no, they weren't billions and billions of dollars, and no, but they were more than being merely symbolic. And for those people who received them, they thought that it made a difference. It made a difference both symbolically and made a difference materially. The money did matter. This sacred and profane distinction that you made, I'm not entirely convinced by it, in the sense that, look, money, these things weren't only about money, but they were certainly some about money. And they made a real difference in the material lives of people. And it seems to me that we can find a third way of coming up with the sum of money that isn't so astronomical and yet is not so, so small as to paltry as to be meaningless. And that would be struck through some kind of deliberation and a deliberative process. I mean, it wouldn't be something that could be decided by fiat. And that's the purpose of talking about reparations, coming up with some way of thinking about it. I appreciate your remarks, I suppose, but I'm unpersuaded by them.
Okay, I'm going to take questions. I'll take questions from the audience. This gentleman here. Okay, I think we're going to ask you to come to the microphone. Can we?
Now, since 1998, this black man, Mr. Salas Muhammad, has repeatedly journeyed across the ocean to Geneva, Switzerland.
Excuse me, do you have a question?
I do, but if I could just pave the way.
Okay.
Pave it quickly, please.
I will.
Thank you.
Okay, this is part of the problem, the suppression of basic information, okay? I'll wrap it up if I can in about 2 minutes, okay?
Maybe a minute.
He has testified about how the U.S. government has practiced ethnocide, forced assimilation, and institutionalized racism against black people, and is thereby violating UN covenants. Now, here's my question. Is anyone in this room aware that the United Nations in March of this year officially recognized Afro-descendants, also known as African Americans, throughout the entire Western Hemisphere as a special category of people who have the right under international law and UN covenants to press massive claims for reparations against the U.S. government, including not just money, gold, and equipment, but real estate, and for those who so desire it, transportation back to our original land.
Okay, let me ask our speakers if they want to comment.
No, I didn't know. Okay.
Okay, and I'm saying, and I'll be glad to sit down in just a moment. The fact that even the highly educated and the well-read like yourself, ma'am, okay, do not know this basic piece of information.
We understand your point. We have a long line. I'm going to have to ask you to sit down.
If you want more information, see me after the meeting.
Thank you. This gentleman.
If I were black, I would be angry, as I think whites should be concerned about this real problem. But I've been taking a course in German policy at BU in the Evergreen program, and I've learned about the unification of Germany, where they've created a social partnership, which has cost hundreds of billions of dollars, over a trillion, and has worked because it has been cooperative. And they have prevented immigration. In other words, they only deal with the people already there. Now, it seems to me that since 1965 in the United States, we have probably spent trillions of dollars on what was geared toward integration of blacks. But most of that money, I also took a course in the American welfare state, most of that money has gone to administrators. About 75% of it goes to the people who try to create it, but also it has gone to Jews, Asians, Hispanics, everybody but the people it was intended to help. I wondered whether there is any hope that you can deal with the obvious real injustice without reducing immigration, which makes the country a pail with a hole in the bottom. In other words, you can keep pouring money in, but more and more people will be acquiring benefits.
Okay. Would either of you like to correct that?
Yeah, I want to comment here prompted by the question, not in direct response to it, but the reparations debate is nested within a certain conception of American nationalism, and I think the question sort of brings this out. That is, we come to the problem because we understand the nation in a certain way. Blacks are in it, dispossessed, unfairly treated within it. The nation has an obligation, and so immigration cuts into that in an awkward way. It's certainly true. I don't think there's really much doubt now, based on the evidence, that the consequence of especially low-skilled immigration from Mexico for the labor market position of low-skilled African Americans has been deleterious. I don't think there's any doubt about that based on the evidence. Blacks have been hurt by that. Okay? Now, here you have a country that's an open society, or understands itself in a certain way as an open society. I understand there's hypocrisy built into that, but still there's the ideal. And it cuts across the grain of reckoning with this kind of open and unreconciled national obligation. It makes it more difficult politically. It makes it more difficult economically. I don't think there's any doubt about that. This is a significant problem. It doesn't pay us to run from it. Now, I don't respond to that by saying the Jews and the Asians and the Mexicans as the enemy, right, who are getting the thing instead of African Americans getting it. But I do want to acknowledge that the ground is complicated, and that's one of the reasons why I think orienting ourselves toward the kind of social democracy that America should be, instead of orienting ourselves toward a racially defined kind of large financial transfer, is a safer and sounder way for us to go in terms of the long-term health of our nation. That's one of the reasons, in order to avoid the potential for a kind of jingoistic or sort of American nationalist talk that would be dangerous. And wouldn't it be awful if we found African Americans sliding some of us into this almost America first camp of I got mine, let the foreigners fend for themselves? Wouldn't that be too bad, really, if that's the way this were to work out?
Okay, thank you. Next question.
Good evening. Fascinating discussion. I find that I have a lot of sympathy for the reparations movement, but it seems to beg a question in my mind. Would this movement be having the popularity that it's having now had we done our real work and had leadership existed around affirmative action?
Well, that's an important question, and I think it's likely that the reparations movement might not be as attractive or less attractive some kind of way if affirmative action policies were not under attack, right? So I think there is some relationship with the shift to the right and the rise of reparations, right? Which is, you all don't want to give us that? Well, we're going to ask, look, let's go for the whole thing. I don't mean to trivialize, but simply to say that it pushes it pushes things further, and that's unfortunate, it seems to me. But it also, if nothing else, the whole reparations debate has certainly advanced and deepened a re-examination of our nation's history, as Mr. Hirsch said in his opening remarks, right? Companies have to give an account. We have to get a richer, fuller sense of how deeply implicated our nation was in slavery and in Jim Crow, and its full and its deepest ramifications. And there's nothing, that seems to me an absolutely unqualified good of the reparations debate, whatever happens with this money thing as such, that if we can begin to honestly retell the American story in a way that is truthful, more truthful than it's been told heretofore, it seems to me that it alone will have done some of its work.
Yeah, Professor Nobles and I are we're in 100% agreement on that. I think the pending demise, if that's what it is, of affirmative action has certainly been a big impetus to the reparations movement. I mean, Randall Robinson says this really in his book. He says, I'm tired of begging white people for affirmative action that they're not going to give us anyway, right? So let's ask for what we're due, and let's be insistent upon it. I think also that there's kind of an irony here, because the grounding of the anti-affirmative action movement of people like Ward Connerly, the politician, businessman out in California who leads ballot initiatives against affirmative action and so forth, the kind of grounding for it is a conception of transcending race, some kind of idea about colorblindness, which is also, I believe, I couldn't prove it scientifically, but I believe it deeply, is also kind of a way of saying, let's not remember what happened. Right. Because there's no way to really remember what happened without seeing it in racial terms. Right. Okay, so to say we're a country without races, race doesn't matter, what Mr. Connerly and his allies are doing now is trying to make it illegal in the state of California to ask anybody what their race is. This is all a way of trying to efface race. We're going to wipe it out, you see. And again, my concern is that at the end of the day, debt paying, formulating the racial obligation in terms of a quid pro quo, abets this race transcending impulse. It furthers it along. It gets people another step down the road of being able to say race is over. See, and race is not going to be over in America for a very, very long time. So I think the reparations and the affirmative action thing are connected up in complicated ways, both in terms of the inspiring or the impetus to African-American advocates of reparations, because they see the clock is waning on affirmative action, but also perhaps in a more subtle way, the anti-affirmative action people in some way are maybe hoping that we can get this reparations thing past us, and then we'll be able to say race is over in America.
Thank you both for your work. I wanted to say a couple things and to preface my question. And my question is for both of you. Specifically, Professor Loury, you talked about the profane and that reparations is about addressing a sacred wound, so to speak, using the profane. However, I found some of your comments to be profane, talking about how a person with a $100 bill wants to get high, and talking about some of the cities around the nation which are being flooded with immigrants, and that this is a post-black and white world, kind of reducing things. And also you mentioned a number of cities in the country, but you didn't mention Boston. A professor at University of Massachusetts in Boston, which is a public university, and my students are predominantly immigrant students from the African diaspora, but also from places like Vietnam, Russia, all over the world. And we talk about reparations in the classroom. And I find that we do have allies, contrary to what some of your ideas suggested, at least to me. I find that when we talk about our shared experiences of oppression, reparations can be understood. I think that the country of America, as we all know, is made with money. It continues to be made with money and revolve around money. But to the extent that the way that immigrant communities change in the country, a lot of the American system, racism, needs to be unmade. And why not unmake it with money, with reparations? My question is about what, if you can talk about what, if any, non-material programs have been suggested as alternatives for reparations. And I'm thinking specifically about education and literacy, because I think, again, that's one place where immigrants and African Americans share something. And I don't think that the African American experience is that exceptional when you look at the diaspora. And so.
Okay, thank you.
Should I respond to that?
Yeah, let's.
Okay.
Professor
because there was a lot there, and I won't take a lot of time, and I'm not sure that I can answer effectively. Certainly, if it's true in your experience at the University of Massachusetts at Boston, that non-African American, non-white immigrants are sympathetic, see some solidarity in reparations, are able to identify with the African American claim, are not put off by it and divided from us by it, then I'm very happy to be wrong about that. Then if I'm wrong about that as a judgment about how people are going to react, then I'll acknowledge that I'm wrong about it and, withdraw that aspect of the argument. I also just want to say that in reference to $100 bills and, quote, immigrants flooding into the cities, close quote, I meant no offense. I just meant to describe a reality. In other words, if people have money and they want to get high, that's what creates a market for drugs. The drugs don't just come up out of nowhere. They come in response to people wanting to buy. And what I was trying to convey with that was that the person who has the $100 bill is no less guilty and no less implicated than is the person who's selling the drug. And yet what we do in terms of our policy mainly is send that person with the $100 bill to a treatment program, and we send that kid who's selling him the drug into a jail. And I think that that's wrong. And that kid is more often black and brown than white. That's just a fact. So I see that. And, when you ask me what are non-money things, let me just talk about some of the areas that really, really, I think, matter in people's lives where money doesn't quite get all the work done. Jails, okay? This is our main institutional response to poor young men. It's punitive. I think that's terrible. I don't think that's a problem that we organize our social response to the marginality and failure of poor young men in a punitive way. I don't think that that's a problem that can be fixed by money. Schools, I mentioned this briefly in my remarks. We are now in the midst of a broad transformation of American education. It's been going on for 15 years. Well, people don't know this. The number of African Americans going into teaching has been falling every year for almost 2 decades because of standards and accountability testing that's keeping African Americans out of the profession because African Americans disproportionately do not pass the verbal and the mathematics exams that teachers in almost every state in the country are now being forced to pass before they can be admitted to the profession. And in our schools right now, and also here in Massachusetts, and I didn't mention Boston mainly because it's not a huge center of African American population concentration, not because I don't know that some of those issues are present here, but huge reforms in education, including in this state, are being implemented in terms of measuring cognitive abilities of students in ways that we know that blacks are going to lag behind. And when these high-stake tests are imposed on people and they don't get degrees or they get tracked into the wrong track or whatever, the injuries last throughout their lifetime. Welfare. We just got through reforming welfare so as to eliminate the federal obligation to support poor children. We'll give them 2 years, we'll give them 5 years, we'll give them a job. Everybody knows that a woman without skills cannot make enough money at a job, even with the earned incomes tax credit and food stamps, to get out of poverty. Welfare rolls have plummeted. Look at the poverty numbers. They haven't fallen in anything nearly proportional to the way that during a huge economic expansion during the 90s, that the welfare roll numbers have fallen. The racial consequences, because the easy-to-treat cases in welfare reform are the ones who are being shown to be successful, they are disproportionately white. The hard-to-treat cases and the real tough cases are disproportionately black and brown, and those people are getting stuck, and when the time limits hit and the economy goes into recession, those people and their children are going to suffer. These are the kinds of things that I think need to be dealt with, and that I don't think can be dealt with money dedicated to black Americans alone. I'm arguing here they can only be dealt with by rethinking our public policies in a broader way. That's a progressive political development that we need allies, and if, immigrants are going to be our allies, then fine. And if talking in reparations talk gets them to be our allies, all the better. I don't think it will, but I could be wrong about that.
Let me ask you to keep your questions concise so we can get through the whole line. Thank you.
Okay, you spoke about the fact that you can't just give money to black schools, but what if money was given to any schools, whether primarily black or interracial, or as part of a scholarship fund, perhaps, for people to go on to higher learning? Would either or both of you agree that that would override the symbol needed, and instead of repaying old debts, would actually be helping something in the present and the future?
Yes?
I guess, the issue is, Glenn's remarks on a certain way, needing a more progressive political agenda. Who would disagree with that? But I don't see a progressive political agenda on the horizon. Is it in the Democratic Party? I suppose. But until, we certainly need a more vibrant left in this country, that's for sure.
Thank you.
Good evening. Good evening. Thank you for both of your comments. I enjoyed both speakers. I have a couple of questions. Professor Loury, again, I know this must have hit a nerve with everyone. The wounds of our person, the wounds of what has happened is really of our person, of ourselves, and you said that it's profane to pay economically. But I think that the early part of this economy was all built economically, and I think that's the only way that the United States will listen, because we only listen when it hits our pockets. Instead of the money coming from individuals, have anyone looked into maybe it coming from corporations or somehow indirectly, so therefore the individual itself doesn't feel like they're paying, being that most corporations have benefited from slavery, that maybe somehow through corporations they can set up some sort of fund? And two, this is a question for both of you, how would reparation really affect affirmative action? If negative, how can we correct this? And if positive, how can we make reparation and affirmative action work together?
Well, because I've been talking, let me not say, too much, but I want to say this. Martin Luther King, Lincoln Memorial, 1963, everybody knows the speech. I have a dream, one day my children will not live in a country they'll be judged by the color of their skin, but rather by the content of their character, and so forth and so on. So iconic King, the model of some kind of race-transcending humanism. Okay? Fast forward. Martin Luther King, Streets of Chicago, 1967. Now he's encountering the institutionalized segregation of African Americans in a northern city. Now he's encountering the consequence of industrial expansion after World War II, huge in-migration of blacks from Mississippi and Alabama and like places. Chicago, an ethnic, white, working-class city, the dealing with that, the carving up of the urban geography, the building of the public housing, okay, so on, so on. Okay. So those are two kings. Now, I mean, I'm trying to relate to your question. Okay. The king in Chicago in 1967 is defeated. He doesn't succeed. His defeat in Chicago, in my judgment, is much more significant in telling us something about America than his victories in Selma or Montgomery, in my view, telling us about how deeply entrenched are the mechanisms of reproducing racial subordination. Okay? So when I use this term sacred and profane, this is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about we have a Martin Luther King Day. We teach our children to salute to Martin Luther King, to look to him to some kind of icon. In other words, we have a Mount Rushmore for blacks, a kind of national symbolic recognition of the significance of the black struggle in American history. That is sacred, not in a religious sense, but it's sacred in the sense that it really stands above people getting paid, and it ought to, And King's defeat in 1967 is the harbinger of where we are right now. Jails full of young blacks, welfare rolls overflowing with black people in poverty, districts of our cities that are black and that are, bombed out and so forth. I don't want to repeat myself, okay? That's a sacred failing, a kind of sin, a kind of civic sin in American life. I'm using a metaphor here in talking these words about sacred and profanity, but the thing that I'm trying to get at is something that requires from us to reach within and examine our relationships with one another versus something that we can deal with in an arm's length quid pro quo fashion. I don't want to see African American claiming reduced to quid pro quo. That's the thing that I'm trying to argue against.
In regards to corporations, I think that the lawsuits being pursued are exactly that, right? So that what I was discussing were the cases that I drew upon were where governments made these reparations through deliberative processes and organizing, domestic political organizing and such, which is separate from lawsuits. So there are lawsuits that are going on now, and we'll see what successes they have. And so the story is yet to be written. On affirmative action. Well, I guess it's too hard to, we don't have a crystal ball, but I assume that we would continue to defend affirmative action and see where the reparations claims go. I mean, there are two things that are kind of two trains going in parallel, but not, kind of going in the same direction. But I don't know yet what the answer. I can't provide an answer. I guess I'm searching for one, but there is. One does not come easily.
And they're not crossing?
I'm not sure that they're crossing. I mean, it just seems that the reparations claims seem to be a reaction to the evident attacks on affirmative action. Thank you.
To kind of expand upon the idea of corporations, because I think the reparations argument is very limited in the sense that, we're only focusing on the government, which basically means the taxpayers. The government's not going to actually pay. They write a check with our money. So that's kind of an unfair thing. So I would like to see the reparations argument broadened to corporations, but also beyond that, globally. America's not the only one that owes. You're dealing with Spain, you're dealing with Portugal, and all the colonizing forces out of Europe. And they should also somehow be made to stand accountable for this and bringing this to more of a world issue, as I believe would have been the attempt at the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, had the United States attended. And also, too, there's this big notion about, like, well, how will we get, these U.S. dollars? Remember that the U.S. Doles out billions of dollars, every year to all sorts of foreign countries that, we probably wouldn't even suspect. And also, too, going beyond the issue of just corporations and opening up to industry itself. Because there were industries that were built on, slave labor and the breaking up of Africa, the continent. For instance, diamonds are a girl's best friend and a nation's worst nightmare. So we're dealing with these issues that are very, very complex. And how do we begin to pluck those? And those are some arguments that I really haven't heard touched on too much. And then basically, too, the relationship with U.S. and Israel right now going on. You being two nations or governments that were built up on land that was not theirs? And what is the implication there? You mentioned a lot about, black failure in schools and all that, and I believe that the larger issue is because these were schools that were never set up for black children to succeed. So your comments.
Thank you.
Why don't we take some more questions and then we'll...
Let's take some more questions.
Well, after listening to your presentations, in my mind, I think logically, if you give someone money, they're going to spend it. It's a type of currency, right? So if you spend it, what happens? You pay for taxes, and it's automatically going to go back to the government. What's going on? You're not getting any money for yourself. So my thought is, why not put it into something that will last longer? If right now, everybody that's over the age of 25 dies right this second, what's going to happen? All you're going to have is youth who are not going to be able to deal with this. As you said, there's people going around who have $100 dealing drugs and all this. Yet you do have those certain people who are actually going into the world and trying to do something. Yet you don't have that much of them. So why not take this money, which would be going to people who are just spending it and going back to the government, and put it into educations, putting more schools that kids can go to make leaders like you all, or putting them into places, land for us to make crops and sell for our own, make our own industries and our own money. We've had many plantations taken away from us that us blacks have owned ourselves, and now who it is not within our communities. The South End right now, before, maybe many years ago, what happened, nobody wanted to be there. It was a place where all the blacks were, and no whites wanted to be there. What happened now? It's being bought up all by a lot of Caucasians and white folks who want to be there, and it's just a business place, which I live right now. So my thought is, what do you think you could do to make it so that the future is better with this money than just spending it and having it go back to the government?
I just want to say thank you very much. There is a discussion about setting up some kind of community fund that would distribute the funds not in an individual way, but in a targeted way towards the community. So that seems to be along the lines that you've suggested.
Hi. I have a couple of questions for Professor Loury. They probably can be answered with one response. But it seems to me like you're straddling a fine line between support for the agenda to deal or address black problems in America, and also sympathy for conservative white agenda which opposes that, which inevitably carries some degree of personal favor. So I'd like to ask you a couple questions to get some clarification from you. In your February 2000 article for Forbes magazine, you mentioned that one of the problems with reparations is that it really only helps a defined racial minority. It only benefits a defined racial minority. But in that same article, further towards the end, you say that you don't see any way to fight black poverty and the other problems that are part of the black community without also fighting poverty and problems of non-black Americans as well. And so it seems to me that that's somewhat of a contradiction. Also, my second question is that in your book, Anatomy of Racial Inequality, you mentioned that you do not like to see, or you don't support black Americans who place themselves outside of the black mainstream in order to gain favor with whites or to gain some kind of unfair advantage over the black majority. You think that hurts, at least from what I understand that you wrote, you think that hurts the black majority. My question to you is, what do you say about about the perception that by placing yourself in opposition to reparations and affirmative action and the liberal individualism, as you call it, you're placing yourself outside the black mainstream and also
okay,
doing,
all right, we get the idea.
damage.
Wait, I have to now ask Professor Loury to be concise as possible because we have about 12 minutes and
yeah, I don't see any contradiction. And I support affirmative action, by the way. I don't want there to be any confusion about that. In my book, I argue strongly in favor of affirmative action. I'm against reparations because I think it's a poor political strategy. I don't see any contradiction. What I'm saying is, just like the young woman who asked that beautiful question just a moment ago, you set up a fund. Now you're going to educate kids. Kids who are hard to educate. You're doing it at a scale that's going to really make a difference in the lives of hundreds of thousands, millions of people. How can such a thing be done in America just for black people? And should such a thing be done in America just for black people? Whatever the nature of our historical having been wronged, right? People need education. People need health care. People need housing. I can't imagine a housing program, a fund for housing, that just helps black people get housing, while others in the same city are going without housing. That is, in my judgment, not what we ought to be doing. So, I put it like that. And in terms of putting myself outside the community, I said that. That was the first thing I said when I stood up. I said, I don't stand up gladly. I don't take any joy in standing up. I understand the symbolic significance of an African American speaking against reparations. That's part of the sort of nature of the discourse that we are in here, that, people's advocacy of one thing or another will be read. It will symbolize something. So if a black man says, well, maybe reparations isn't the best idea, there are a lot of white conservatives, yes, including some of the editors at Forbes magazine, who are going to love that. But I'm an independent-minded person. I wrote a whole book. It's not right, but it's my view, and I set my view out at great length there, and I think that I can defend myself against the charges of logical inconsistency, and certainly against the charges of being somehow a traitor or someone who's antagonistic to the interest of African Americans. That's not true about me.
Well, I know that reparations is a very controversial and emotional topic. But when I look at reparations, when I think of slavery, I think of being robbed of everything that I would have had. My language, my culture, my ancestors whom I know not, what part of Africa I came from, I know not. What I want to know is, because you stated a lot of things about crime and of over 1 million black men, or about a million men in prison. A lot of these things, the drugs that we see our people in the condition that they're in, are the lingering effects of slavery. This is how I view it, and this is how I look at it. So in order for us to get to the solution, we have to deal with the issues or the cause first. My question to the both of you is this, and it's a two-part question. Reparations is an issue for black people. If we as black people can't come together on an issue that is to benefit us, then what do you propose that we do? Part one. Part two is, do you think that if we could come together in unity to fight for reparations, that we could ask that reparations have options, such as those that will cover the things for those people who wish to remain here in America and make it work for them the best way that they can, and then another one for maybe those who wish to develop their own land, teach their own children, raise their own foods, therefore, because we have a lot of educated black people who are well equipped to do everything that the Caucasian does right here in America. So can you answer that for me? Thank you.
Let me just say one thing briefly. It's about, this is an issue for black people. Black people can't come together on it. So here we are at the Old South Meeting House, Ford Hall Forum. So this is an open forum to the public. This is an American conversation that we're having here. This is not a black person's conversation. Here, this one. Now there can be another venue and another conversation. I imagine the conversation would be very different in another venue, church basement, community hall, mosque, or something like that, African American community come together talking about what we should do around this issue. And I don't know, if I could get out of such a conversation alive, I'd be happy to participate in it. And what I would have to say in that conversation would be a very different thing. That's the thing that I'm talking about. So these discourses are really kind of separate. And, you know, if anybody cares, I can imagine sitting down with people like Professor Nobles here and others and coming, if they would have me, to some kind of consensus about what it is that ought to be advocated here. I can imagine that. That's not beyond my imagining because I don't think our ultimate objectives are really all that different.
In response to coming together, certainly it's true that in cases that were successful that I mentioned in my talk, the recipients of the reparations were fairly well organized around, or at least there was enough people who were actively involved in it. So necessary but insufficient condition will be for African Americans to be behind it in some appreciable way. It doesn't stop there. It's just necessary, but it's not sufficient.
Greetings. I thank both of you for your work. I am a Creole from Louisiana, Baton Rouge to be exact, where slavery was in great deal of occupation there. First, I want to state, you made a statement of blacks in America not being able to grow as other people have come to America, other cultures have come to America and grown and strived and prospered. I feel that in order for a people to be free, not only physically free, but mentally and spiritually free, that's the only way that we're able to strive and gather who we are. As the other woman said, I feel like I have been stripped of my culture, stripped of my language, as I only speak English now, so my native tongue is not here anymore. Also, I feel that reparations, as in Israel being funded $3 billion a year, I feel that reparations, as you are on a platform, just the tip of the iceberg, and that we need this to start where we begin to build our communities and buy and sell and own in our own communities, as the Asians have come and done, as the Jews have come and done, and many other nations have come to do here in America. So, in conclusion, I feel that reparations is of great need for our children, descendants of the slaves. They have no idea of who they are here in America. I see many of our communities who are lost. And as I said before, they let the slaves physically free, but not spiritually nor mentally free. That's one of the reasons why we have not gained prosperity, as you said, here in America. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take the next question.
Hi. Obviously, education is a significant part of becoming prospering in America. My question is, do you think that if the proper reparations were paid after the Civil War, when it was time for it to happen, do you think, towards black education, do you think that the racial barrier today would be, like, there would be a racial barrier today, or if any?
That's a good question.
Well, yeah, things have gone as they should have after Reconstruction, right? Where people were given some compensation, allowed to settle up and own land and reap the wealth of their labor. Had there been no segregation laws and the like, and no extra legal violence and such, if we had had a different history, we likely would have had a different present. And that's precisely what we're talking about, right? Yeah, so yes, things might have been different, but it didn't turn out that way, right?
Well, only if you could prosper in education back then. If they had, because lack of education equals lack of skill, which leads to poverty, and it's a constant cycle. It's been through our past.
Right. Well,
and that leads today the gap in society between the majority and the minority.
Right. Well, there were lots of things that went wrong after slavery, and that was certainly one of them, the lack of education for black people.
Queen, you take the next question.
Thank you
very much.
Speaking as a lifelong civil rights advocate and the beneficiary of a very strong family of advocates over 10 generations in this country, which is a company, I mean, when you think of it. Nice little Freudian slip. My question is, why continue the offense if we all agree that slavery was the most horrendous offense to human dignity we've encountered because a people were treated exclusively and objectified? Why continue to go back to the table and have a discussion with an oppressor, if we're going to use these terms loosely, who has acted in bad faith in all of your previous discussions? If you're saying that what separates you two, it's not acknowledging the wrongs, we agree to the wrongs, but how you come to the table, how you engage in the dialogue. Why leave behind potential supporters, in particular for your position, because I think the information in your position is excellent. The education about the wrongs and excellent. But for someone like me, okay, I can barely stand in the room. It is visceral to me. It is not historic and distant. When someone says, okay, we will reduce this issue to a dollars and cents opportunity for an oppressor to pay a bill and walk out the door, why not show good faith, model good faith, and go to the higher standard that the young lady previously spoke to and build from the present forward, holding the government accountable for all of the people and its duty to all of the citizens.
Okay, all right. This oppressor is going to let her speak. Go ahead.
Right. Well, I mean, your remarks are compelling. I can't easily respond to them. I don't know that it's all, if what we're saying is entirely mutually exclusive.
I don't think so.
And it's more of a point of emphasis, I assume. But so I'm not disagreeing with you. But I will have to take some time to reflect upon it. And I'm sorry that we're running out of time and I can't do it in the way I'd like to. Thank you.
Hi, good evening to the both of you. I want to thank you both for being here, and I want to thank all the previous speakers for sharing their ideas, and to the both of you as well. My comment, and you may respond to this, is to Professor Loury. Your ideas seem to be highly idealistic for many reasons that I can't, simply for a lack of time, that I can't get into. But almost to the point of being dangerous, actually. You seem like a fairly intelligent man. You would know that if you were wronged, someone who has wronged you will pay the price somehow, if not monetarily, then in some other shape or form. Money doesn't solve all problems, as you previously stated, and I do agree with that. However, if you actually go out into your community, or if you don't live in a black community, into a black community, and see the slums and see the young folks that seem to don't even have a soul, those that are in prison and incarcerated that you spoke about, these young people don't need an apology alone. They need systems in place to help them get on their foot. They have lost confidence. They have lost a moral ground to go forward, if you will. I do want to say that while I am young, I believe myself to be practical. Just a few months ago, during the tragic events of September 11th, one way that this nation responded to the attacks was to cut off the funding from Al-Qaeda. By your idea, we would have probably sought an apology from Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and try to go forward and not do anything with the money.
That's not my idea.
Professor
We're at the end of the hour, and I have to answer this. That's not my idea. That's not what I said. I didn't say get an apology. I said an expansive social democratic vision. This is what I am saying. I'm saying that we put more people in jail in this country than any other nation in the world by far. South Africa and Russia are the only places that come close. We don't have to do that. Now, it's not idealistic to envision a politics where we don't put 2 million people in jail every year. We don't have to do that. We don't have to have a prison industrial complex. I'm not idealistic for thinking that the hard work of building coalitions to object to the George Bush vision, lock them up, throw away the key, execute the SOBs, that to try to build a politics against that is idealistic. It is not. As a matter of fact, it's the only way. The only way to house the blacks in this country who don't have housing, I'm going to repeat myself, the only way to feed these kids who are hungry and who are in poverty, the only way to educate the ones that our schools fail systematically, the only way to get a different kind of social policy as we deal with indigent and marginal young men than the punitive one that we have, is to change the laws and the social policies so that the way in which America deals with its needy people looks a little bit more like the way that the Germans or the Swedes or the French deal with their needy people. I want to get from here to there. That's not asking for an apology. There's nothing idealistic about it. In fact, this feel-good rhetoric, pay us reparations, we suffered, we were in slavery, is a substitute for politics. Okay? While the Christian coalition was almost unheard of, they were organizing school districts, state representative campaigns. They were taking over the Republican Party in South Carolina, Mississippi, and like places. They were doing spade work on the ground to bring their vision of America into the center of American politics. We progressives who bemoan the consequences of slavery have no alternative other than to do the same thing. And if it takes 20 years, that's how long it takes.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we're going to wrap it up.
A quick question, Professor Noble. Just assume you go to court, an attorney does, and wins the case, and someone cuts a check. How do you verify African ancestry who biologically is black? I have a problem identifying my relatives, and there are people who look white, they're actually black, and I believe that there would be some imposters. But that's just one quick question. Professor Loury, I come away with the sense that you in some way actually have an alternative idea that there's a form of poverty that could be responded to by a social policy that doesn't relate to money, but I don't hear Professor Noble really saying that it's about money. She has the idea of community benefits, and my father supports the idea of reparations, and I tell him, right here in Boston, there's a $1 billion fan peer project. People are getting community benefits, development projects all around the state. Black communities aren't benefiting. I see you as possibly, I think you should instead try and formulate a policy related to how the state currently allows the development projects to be permitted and tie it for black community, not black communities, communities based on economic need in terms of developing the infrastructure. It would be helpful, I think, if you could say that this is my alternative policy. You instead say, I don't know what that policy is.
All right, let's
also, just related to the land issue, I agree that the monetary amount, billions of dollars, would be easily spent quickly and it would be meaningless to a person's humanity. And I tell my dad, okay, let's just settle this. All blacks, wherever they are in the U.S., just give them that land, let them own it, and that would take care of that. But anyway, just the question in here.
Well, just very briefly, the alternative policies that I did talk about, the expansive social democratic vision, the reform in the areas of criminal justice, education, welfare, and the rest, are all going to cost a lot of money. Okay, I want to disabuse people of this idea that I've said up here that all you have to do is engage in symbolism and nobody has to ever spend any money. I'm not saying that at all. What I've said is that the money has to be spent in a way that gets at basic structural issues in American social organization, not that is dedicated to, in a compensatory way, to